Good morning. Good morning. If you, plenty of seats up front. It's sort of like school. Nobody wants to sit in the front of the classroom. Wait till everybody gets a chance to get seated. Well, good morning, everyone. It's so good to see you. My name is Rod Grammer. I'm President and CEO of Idaho Business for Education. And for those of you who don't know, IBE is a group of more than 250 business leaders across the state, from Sandpoint to Soda Springs to Idaho Falls. And our whole mission is to strengthen education in Idaho from kindergarten through higher education. It's so good to see so many of you here in person. In fact, this is the first in-person Legislative Academy we've had in 3 years. The last two have been virtual, so it's really great to see you. And also, I want to thank welcome the people who are joining us online. I know a lot of folks are doing that. I also want to thank Idaho Public TV for doing our streaming today. Over the past 11 years, we've had some amazing and thought-provoking speakers here at the Legislative Academy. We've had academics from prestigious universities like Stanford. We've had economists insightfully making sense of our economy, and like last year, talking about the structural labor shortage that our country has right now. We've had the former Commissioner of Education in Kentucky speak to us, and even a 3-star general a couple of years ago talking to us. We even had a former Secretary of Education, William Bennett, who was President Reagan's Secretary of Education. So we've had some wonderful speakers. Today we have a speaker who is a veteran educator. He's an educator who comes from rural Indiana and serves the students and educators of rural Indiana. He flew all across the country all day yesterday, getting in late yesterday evening. So welcome to Idaho, Chris. It is clear by now that the decision whether to pass voucher-like legislation this session will be one of the most spirited and consequential debates of the 2023 legislature. Having reported 11 legislatures as a reporter and have served the last 10 as an advocate for education, I can say with some certainty that this debate over vouchers will be the most important education debate since statehood. Some of you might be thinking, well, that's an exaggeration or it's an overstatement. But I don't think it is if you consider the constitutional stakes that are involved in this debate. For one, providing taxpayer dollars to private and religious schools would automatically nullify Article 9, Section 5 of the Idaho Constitution by statute rather than by a vote of the people as the legislature requires, or the Constitution requires. Second, it would make it even more difficult for Idaho to meet its financial requirements of Article 9, Section 1 of the Idaho Constitution, which mandates the legislature to fund a uniform, thorough, and free education system. The Idaho Supreme Court has already ruled and questioned whether the legislature is in compliance with the Constitution. Fortunately for Idaho, I think, we can learn a lot from what has happened in other states that have vouchers or education savings accounts or tax credits by looking at states like Indiana, Wisconsin, Ohio, Arizona, that have had these laws for a long time. One of those states is Indiana, as I mentioned. Our speaker today is very familiar with what has happened in Indiana and will paint a picture for what Idaho could look like a few years from now if we pass this legislation. Dr. Chris Lagoni is the Executive Director of the Indiana Small and Rural Schools Association. He represents 100 rural schools in Indiana with student populations of roughly 500 to almost 5,000. He has been an educator for 30 years. He served as a classroom teacher, as a vice principal, and as a superintendent in a small rural school district in Indiana. Besides heading up the Rural Schools Association, Dr. Lagoni is also a professor at Wesleyan University in Indiana. He holds a doctorate in education from Purdue University. So I'd like to have us all give Chris Lagoni a warm Idaho welcome.
Thank you for that welcome. I'm excited to be here. We have a beautiful state and a beautiful city. I'm here just to kind of document our journey since 2011 on voucher expansion in Indiana, kind of tell our story, what it's done as far as a policy outcome, and could you use that information to help guide your policy discussions here. One of the first questions that we start with for my membership is, did the voucher expansion in Indiana benefit my rural Indiana citizens? After all, I'm an advocate for the students and for the families and the communities of rural Indiana. And so much what happens in Indiana State House is a little bit about urban education. All the policies are focused on urban education. Most of the ideas that are coming out are on cities and reforms there. And so, here's some pictures of a few of our constituents. We've got a couple farmers from Indiana in our districts. We have some students doing presentations. The small group on the right, that's a building trades group of students from a place called White County, Indiana. That's 30-40% Hispanic. And on the left is our students who visited the IU Medical School. We help coordinate a program where we take students from rural Indiana and we send them to the IU Medical School for a day so they can see what it's like to spend a day in residency, because rural health care is an issue. We need students to see a vision. There's not a lot of hospitals in rural Indiana, and so we want to expose those students to the opportunity, and they make great connections with fourth-year medical students and now have advocates and mentors helping them in their journey. So that's kind of the starting conversation with my board. And no matter your politics, Indiana, like a lot of rural areas, is fiscally conservative. I put up a little cartoon, say, stop saying you're fiscal conservative, you're just cheap. I was a superintendent in a small district in Carroll County, Indiana, and swine production is our major industry in Carroll County. There might be 20,000 people in the county, but there's 250,000 hogs. And so our school served no beef was served in our school. It was pork burgers. If you went to the ball games on Friday night, you had pork burgers or you had pork tenderloin. Those were your choices. Pork was king in our community. I have a picture of a barn silo there because there was a famous story when I came on as a superintendent. There was a board member. He was the largest landowner in the county, and he had more farmland and grain operation. He probably had 50,000 swine and a CAFO. And the famous story was he had a grain silo on a farm he bought, and he did not need it anymore, and he was going to build one that was bigger. So he had his employees tear down the grain silo, but he kept all the hardware and bolts and made them take all the bolts out of there because he was going to reuse them on the new silo. That's fiscally conservative. But as I tell you about this journey, you need to understand a little bit about what Indiana's choices look like. So in 2009, the state rolled back and said, we're going to be doing some reforms. We're going to take away the public local tax for teacher salaries. Most states and have some sort of teacher salary portion of the local levy, and the state's going to take that over. Now, when they did that, that opened up and it was allowed full choice as far as open enrollment between schools. You could go to any school district once the state took that over, because the schools couldn't say, well, if you transfer in, we have this levy for teachers and you need to pay us transfer tuition. All that was gone. So starting around 2011, open enrollment was the law in Indiana. So that's one type of choice. You can live anywhere and you can go to any school district. Second, there were charter schools. That was another choice option. And then starting in 2011, we had vouchers for private schools. And then starting about 2 years ago, we've expanded to educational savings accounts where if you're homeschooled, if you're not in school, and you want to receive special ed services, you can access one of those. So those are the kind of the key choices I just want you to understand as we start this conversation. Get the right side of the mouse here. So again, Indiana's voucher program started in 2011. The first year it started, it was incremental. It was limited to 15,000 students. And there was only two ways to get in. You had to do 2 semesters in a public school pathway, or you had to be of a certain poverty level. It didn't stay that, but that's how it started. And it has incrementally grown since then. This graph documents the amount of money in Indiana that has gone from what is called our tuition support, which is what all schools receive, to currently in 2021, 2022, approaching $300 billion. So you have to realize Indiana has a little bit larger student population. We have about 1 million students in Indiana. The population of the state's about a little over 5 million. So you can see in 2011, there was incremental, just those first few students. But one of the messages I'd like to convey is it's never enough. The voucher expansion pressure was constant in Indiana. The ways to access the voucher expanded consistently until we get to a pretty large chunk of money. You're going to see this graph again. And I give you this number just to kind of sticker shock for legislators at the time. So in 2009, that bottom number, around $2 billion in tuition support, that's what it was before Indiana enacted its reforms to say you're no longer to have a local levy for teacher salaries. That's what the state share was. Once Indiana implemented that reform and took over all funding and said we're going to fund all these different choices, tuition support shot up to $6 billion. And that was sticker shock for a lot of legislators. So what we found out over time is that really didn't cover the full amount. When we looked at what the schools had in their levies versus what the state took over, there was actually about a $357 million shortfall. Now that wasn't totally there, so as schools started raising concerns and saying, hey, we're getting a lot less money than we did when we had our local levies, the legislators were like, what? We tripled the amount of money we sent you. What's the problem? So there was some sticker shock in the transition. So I just kind of want to plant that seed. Budgets are every 2 years, and so each one of those represents, and we ended the last one at almost $8 billion in tuition support. So this graph just kind of documents, again, that sticker shock, especially for rural fiscal conservatives who didn't understand at the time this transition. It's saying, wow, we jumped up the amount of money we're supporting schools, but we were also supporting multiple systems and new students who had not been in under tuition support before. This graph kind of documents the transition of the student population. I have to get here my glasses, my bifocals. So the blue line on the bottom documents how enrollment grew from 2011. That's the enrollment of choice students or voucher accepting students. The orange line documents the students in private schools but were not funded by vouchers. The gray line represents the total enrollment. In 2011, there were little over 72,000 students in private schools in Indiana. And in 2022, depending on whose source you look at, is somewhere around 83 to 84,000. So that's what the end of the gray lines, 72, 83, 84. At peak in 2017, there were 86,000. And so you see the blue line starts to intersect with the orange line. And part of the reason that was because Indiana raised the income levels over time to where in Indiana you can earn 300% of the federal poverty margin and still earn a voucher for your students. So it's not just about poverty anymore. There's a lot of people accessing the vouchers. And so at 300%, we're talking $150,000 to $160,000 a year. and you're getting a voucher. Overall, private school enrollment gained about 13 to 14% over that 10-year period. So here's Indiana's overall student population, 1.12 million. You can see the traditional public still has 984,000, charters around 50, and then not choice students, 39,000, but a majority of the private school students are now under a choice scholarship. So one of the things that we were told and how legislators were approached with the program is that the focus of the program, that this was going to be on students who were in public schools, maybe they were failing, and these students needed a choice, and that private schools were going to become this choice, and we were going to help students and get them out of failing public schools. As the program expanded, it quickly became apparent that really it was more about funding students who were already in the private schools. There was an NPR article, and Father Jake Runyon was talking in Fort Wayne, our second largest city, and sent a newsletter to his constituents and kind of documented, really, it's just more of the students who are already here earning a vouchers. We're not getting more students from the schools, from the public schools. So how did Indiana fund this expansion? When we went and took away the local levy so that we could lower property taxes, we increased the sales tax from 6 to 7%. Indiana has no sales tax at the local level. This city has this little, sales tax. Over time, there has been less funding per capita for colleges. There's been less healthcare funding per capita. Those fundings have gone up, but the per capita is still pretty low. And this is my personal thought. We've used a lot of gaming revenue to help fund this. In 14 and 15, or 15 and 16, you can see about what we collect in gaming revenue. In Indiana, the state sponsors the gaming. There are private companies doing this. This is not Native Americans. So Indiana has greatly expanded its gaming, and we're up to almost $1 billion in tax revenue from gaming, from additional casinos, online sports betting, and it's my opinion that without this extra revenue, this voucher expansion would have been difficult. So what was the fallout for public schools? Public schools lost money if a student transferred, of course, but that's part of the choice argument. But it still had fixed costs to keep those schools open. You could lose a few students here, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade. Those costs were still there. The rural schools, as you probably have studied, rural America has fewer people. Birth rates are down. People move where the opportunities are. The kindergarten classes coming in are just smaller than the 12th grade classes we're graduating. So the cash balances were really hurt. The funding went down for rural schools, and we've had some schools that had to close elementaries. And the biggest hit, I would say, is the support staff. Our organization started in about 14, 15. We started here in membership. We needed funding for counselors. We were losing counselors. We weren't able to replace counselors. And we all know with workforce placement, counselors are very crucial. We need kids to understand their opportunities. They need to understand their strengths. And so we were kind of focused on getting some additional funding for counselors. That never happened. But this graph comes from the Center for Educational Policy at Indiana University, and it documents how much funding went down over that time. And so this represents the percentage change in total student support. So once we made the shift and there was no longer a local tax support for students, all your dollars comes from the state on a per student funding. So if there's a student in your doors, that's $6,000. If there's 2 students, that's $12,000, whatever it be. But you can see in 2013, 2 years after the voucher expansion, Indiana rural schools were receiving 10% less in per student funding than they were in 2009 prior to the reforms. By 2017, tuition support at the state level had continued to go up, but we were still at 5% less than the 2009 levels. And that somewhat makes sense because we are funding more students, more choices. We are supporting multiple systems of a common school. And so when we do that, everybody gets less. So again, I asked the question, how is this benefiting my rural students, my citizens, the people we're trying to represent? The fiscal impact ended up hurting property taxes. As schools received less money, they were forced to do supplemental levies to stay open, and we're going to roll through that. So as the state funding went down and they were getting less per student, that put more pressure on the local taxpayers who were told, hey, we're going to lower your taxes, the state's going to take it all over, we're going to give you just funding per student. But it put a lot of pressure on schools, and so let's kind of look at some of that data. If you hold up a C with your left hand and kind of put right under Fort Wayne and put it around Indianapolis, that's kind of the corn belt of Indiana, where the most rural parts are. Each orange dot represents a private school. And so you can see they're probably like Idaho, it's going to be a little more condensed around the urban areas. Some of the small towns have one. Maybe it's a K-6 Catholic school or something elementary. It's very difficult to have a high school, comprehensive high school, unless you have enough students. So it really wasn't, this voucher choice expansion really wasn't helping my students and my citizens. They didn't have access. But the choice, remember I talked about public school choice, did, because if they were dissatisfied, they could go across the county, across the district. And some of them benefited. And as we saw from the SEEP data, the financial hit was all across the state. Private schools, as we said, don't locate in our areas. The choice for our rural students is public school choice. We saw that the funding decreased. We had less counselors. There were staffing issues. We all know, and you've talked about it, the staffing crunch. Salaries have had to come up as we cannot find people, and that puts more pressures on schools to do supplemental levies to make up the difference to keep the staff or find quality staff or even find anybody. Taxpayers are facing higher tax bills as this program has rolled out. Here's a few examples of cash balances. This is South Adams. This is public data I got right from the DOE and DLGF website in Indiana. So this is their cash balance starting in 2013, 2 years after the reforms were enacted. And you can see the gradual trend line, their cash balance is decreasing. It's a very rural area. They have a large Amish population, Anabaptist. They stopped going to school typically around 8th grade in Indiana. Then they transition to working on the farm or other opportunities. So we compare South Adams enrollment, which is the lower right graph, to its cash balance that we previously saw. And it's directly connected, and that one makes sense. Funding is based on the students. If your students are declining, then your overall cash balance is going to decline. Some people would say, well, that school district needs to consolidate. Well, there's a limit based on geography and distance for all schools. We can't just consolidate away our options. This is Benton County. Benton County is the largest geographic area in Indiana. It's 406 square miles. That's probably a small school district in Idaho, but for Indiana, that's our largest, less dense area. So their general fund balance, you can see there's a slight increase, and then the trend goes down. Benton does have a small K-6 Catholic school in its community, and we can see the trend line as enrollment decreased in the lower graph on the right, cash balance dipped on the left. That would make sense. I don't think there's any data surprise there. This is Bar Reeves. Bar Reeves is down by the Ohio River. Also a high Anabaptist Amish population in Bar Reeves, but their funding went up. And that's because as soon as 2009 happened and the reforms happened, the governor at the time, we were all in the middle of the Great Recession, he told Indiana schools right before all these reforms happened, we're short about $300 million in revenue. You're going to have to make up the difference. We can't send it to you. So Bar Reeves started working on a supplemental levy. And so I show you the example. They passed the supplemental levy right before 2013. It started to come in 14. And with the supplemental levy, their cash balance went up. Now, this district's only about 750 kids in it. And their enrollment was slightly increasing. I think they went up 100 kids in 5 years. But 100 kids in 5 years wouldn't do the cash balances we saw. It was the supplemental levy that enabled them to increase their cash balance. So you have some background here. And so when I start this analysis and I have conversations in Indiana, I kind of have the conversation. Are you a fiscal conservative? Do you believe in fiscal responsibility? Do you want to reduce the size of government? Do you favor tax cuts? If we're going to build a bridge, I want a quality bridge. I want to know quality materials. I want to know the concrete's been tested. I want to know the pressure tests. I'm fine. I'm going to pay for it, and I will give you the contract as the contractor build it. But I have certain expectations from my taxpayers and constituents. I want a quality bridge that's going to last 40, 50 years. We also favor transparency. Legislature and taxpayers have a right to know how their money's being spent. That's what I think of when I think of a fiscal conservative. We know that the costs to the general fund are going to go up as we cover more and more students, picking up private and religious schools. There's not really any oversight in how the tax dollars are being used. And we're subsidizing a private enterprise in some cases. Private and religious schools are private enterprises, and some are even connected to for-profit entities. I'm doing some research right now in Indiana. I'm trying to calculate the cost of producing a graduate. So I'm looking at 13 years of expenditures. I'm trying to figure out for every charter school and public school in Indiana, if you have a graduate that crosses the line, passed all the state tests, and is ready to join the workforce, what has been the expenditure level for that student? Well, I have no idea for the private schools in Indiana. There is no data. There's no data collection. I can't access. I can't document it. All I can do it for is public and charter. I don't think that's transparency, but we'll get to that later. A rationale for the voucher programs in Indiana was, hey, financial aid pays for higher ed in private schools. Why not do the same in K-12? Well, I would also say that the U.S. DOE has the ability under the Federal Code of Regulations to audit financial aid records. We've seen schools that have been shut down and had their financial aid turned off because they didn't do good results. ITT, there was a big scandal about them taking all this federal tuition dollars, not producing quality programs, not producing quality students. I see no reason why, if we're going to give out financial aid, we couldn't have a fiscally responsible oversight. Some sort of budget plan, transactions. Do we know that the lowest bidder was the person who received the funds and not the church rector's son who owns a construction business? I mean, do we know that it's the highest or lowest bidder? And then some sort of internal controls. I think would be normal if we were asking to use tax dollars. That's just me. So again, we'll bring you back to this number of approaching $300 million in tuition support. This is the same fund that all charter schools and public schools, it's just a per student fund, and we're approaching $300 million. We're not talking about $100,000. $300 million is a lot of dollars to not know the results, the oversight, or the quality. Now, I'm not putting down private schools. There's some good private schools, but if you're going to accept the old adage is if you're going to accept the public dollars, there are certain conditions that should come along with that. This is the percent of increase in voucher spending per year, and obviously it's larger as it kind of shows you in this graph how much they expanded the eligibility over the years. So I kind of cross out fiscal responsibility. If we're fiscally conservative, I don't connect the way the voucher schools and the way Indiana's passing out the dollars with being fiscally responsible. Fiscal conservatives would want to reduce the size of government. When Indiana expanded it to educational savings accounts, We are now going to pay for homeschooled students who've never been in school, have made no choice to enter into any sort of education, even a private school. But if they want to go to an ABA therapy place or something else, we're going to give them a voucher to do that. That's expanding. That's another program. And then Indiana had to come back and say, okay, if we're going to do some of these things, we've got to expand the bureaucracy of our treasuries, our Department of Treasury. They're going to run the educational savings accounts through the treasurer's office. I don't know why, instead of the DOE. So the treasurer's office came back and said, I need $1 million more to hire more staff to handle this bureaucracy. Well, if you're fiscally conservative, we're not really reducing the size of government. We're creating more programs that require more people to monitor and do them. And I get that. That's the trade-off. Reducing the size of government, I mean, if we're going to say reducing the size of government, one representation of the size of government is the continually expanding amount of dollars that we spend. So the graph on the far left looks at overall tuition support in Indiana. So 2009, you can see we were still under the overall local taxpayer support, and then it jumps up in 11 as the state took over all control. We've slowly been increasing the amount of tuition support coming out, and then a reminder of the graph of the decrease. Our treasurer's office is now doing things. The Department of Workforce Development has had to increase their staff. They're taking on CTE. Our legislature has passed around all these different pieces. The Family and Social Service Administration, they now have had to add staff because they're going to handle all the pre-K stuff. We already have a DOE. We already have a Department of Education with staff in place, yet our implementation seems to be focused on expanding all these other governmental offices. So we're not reducing the size of government. So how did we pay for this? Well, if you're a fiscal conservative, you favor tax cuts. Indiana did increase the sales tax from 6 to 7%. That was very transparent. We've increased gaming taxes in 2017. As I mentioned, we're up to $1 billion in gaming taxes. Now communities on an individual basis are asked to re-raise their property taxes in a supplemental levy, and that has really taken off since 2009. The head of the Indiana Superintendents Association has a famous saying, it's not a matter of if you're going to do a supplemental levy, it's just a matter of when in Indiana now. And that was unheard of. Before 2009, very few schools had ever done a supplemental levy. They had a small levy that did their local support. The state paid for their part, but those days are gone. One of the keys, and I was talking to Rod about, is we're a partner of the Indiana Farm Bureau. We have a strong connection. We're an in-kind partner because Indiana Farm Bureau is interested in rural communities. And they clearly recognize that their farmers, large landowners, are being asked and taxed more to support and keep their local schools open since these reforms have come out. And that's not where Indiana Farm Bureau is interested. They don't want to see higher taxes on landowners. But that has been one outcome. So this is 2022 in November, just to kind of give you an example of the kind of numbers we're talking about. These are 4 rural school districts that in 2022 asked to raise their taxes. And the choice programs, we're focused on per student funding. Brown County is a county-wide school district south of Bloomington. They're decreasing student enrollment in order to keep their staff and the programs they've had. They had a supplemental levy passed about 7 years ago. In Indiana, 7-8 years, they expire. The taxpayers have to choose to renew them. They were asking for a 12 cents per $100 in assessed value. Total budget of the additional ask was $15 million on the local taxpayers. Delphi Community Schools is east of Lafayette. They were asking for 20 cents. That failed. Medora Community Schools, one of the small school districts in the state, they asked for 50 cents. That failed. Southern Wells, $1.27. You can see the total budget there. So that kind of gives you a kind of picture of what the total dollars are. What's that mean for additional tax for individual taxpayers? So this is data, again, from CEAP, the Center for Educational Policy. They keep a database of Indiana referendums. In Indiana, we call supplemental levies referendums. So if you hear the term referendum, they call it a referendum because it goes on the local question and the taxpayers have to approve it in a vote. So it's like a referendum. So The bar graph represents the average tax rate for the past referendum. So you can see the reforms started to come out. We had a $300 million loss prior to 2009, 2011. They come out with the school choice, and then boom, by 2012, the average ask in a levy was 40 cents. If you owned a house that was $250,000, a 40-cent increase is adding $1,000 to your tax bill. And you can kind of see that those referendums got right around 20 cents on average. That's about a $500 ask. And so they've been happening more and more in Indiana. Here's the numbers. This data comes from one of my doctoral students. He's researching this topic. There's been 86 rural referendums since 2008. The average passage rate is 54 cents. For suburban communities, it's even higher. And for general fund, meaning teacher salaries, there's been 158 across all school districts since 2009. This kind of breaks down what the average increase in taxes has been for passing ones. And Benton Central did, the school district I showed you earlier, they did pass a referendum recently. And in the lower right picture, that's Bar Reeves, who did pass their referendum. So our local communities are willing to support their local schools. You know, in a rural area, your school is the central location of the economy. The stores, the banks, all those things are located and focus on that rural school. So people are willing to make that investment. I guess the policy question is, why do these communities have to make that investment? So I hope that you take away one thing from this. With less state support dollars, we've had to go to the voters to make up the difference. This hits Main Street businesses, homeowners hard. In Indiana, if you own a business, you're taxed at 3%. If you're a farmer, you're taxed at 2%. And if you're a homeowner, you're taxed at 1% of your assessed value. Declining populations, paired with a strong desire to keep their community schools open, some communities are voting to raise their taxes. Some are not. It's not, the success rate in our areas is not as high as it is in other communities. Some are, but some aren't. And then that's putting more pressure on the schools to figure out how they're going to survive. So I would not say tax cuts with this program are present. If you're a fiscal conservative, I hope you believe in accountability. The only accountability is if people stay at the voucher program. I have data I didn't include in this presentation in the interest of time, but it's about a 70% retention year to year, varying across the years, 70 to 80%. There's no real accountability in how dollars are spent. We have no oversight on what the plans are. The public cannot have a voice. If there's a concern, your only choice is to transfer out of the school. Patrons have no insights or public review of how the funds or what the funds are going to be used for. One outcome we've seen in Indiana, and it blurs the lines, but this Father Jake again, he wrote in this newsletter, and it was kind of picked up by the local media. He was really excited about the voucher programs because they were finally going to be able to repair the church and some rectory issues because of the success and influx of dollars with their voucher program. There's a new model for church construction in Indiana. This article comes from Seventh-day Adventist Church. They broke ground in an ambitious effort to build a new elementary school, which is going to be the first phase of the launch pad. And that is basically the new model for church construction in Indiana. You build a school first. You use the facility on Sundays, the gym or the cafeteria for services. You collect the choice dollars. You pay down the debt. And then you can add buildings and services from there as you grow it. I mean, that's just what is happening in Indiana. And this is for all faiths. Indiana does not discriminate. We have We have Jewish private schools receiving vouchers. We have Muslim private schools. We have Christian. We have Catholic. Here's an article about East Columbus. They were going to increase the size, and they needed to stop using part of the church as our schoolrooms and build on for the school. But I just want you to know, Indiana's expansion of vouchers is paying for all types of schools. If you favor accountability, we were going to be rescuing students from low-performing schools and sending them to high-performing schools. There's been some research out there. The most famous one was from Waddington and Barron's, and it really didn't show any success or improvement in math achievement. This is from University of Notre Dame. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to say they're biased towards public schools. The students did not show math improvement. In fact, they were behind, and the English scores were kind of static. Another study I found that really, if you take away SES level, the income level, private schools are really not making a difference for students who are from lower SES levels. Once you take away where the student came from and adjust it based on the population, there's really no advantage. Here's a quote from Fordham Institute, documented that beyond academic impacts, there really wasn't much improvement. There's an advocate, Arthur Garnett. If they wanted to ask if these programs were working for them, we'd have to say the choice has not really led to any ability to weed out poor performing schools. And so the accountability is not there. And in fact, the conversation, if you listen to advocates of the voucher programs, they're focused now more as, well, we really don't want to talk about test scores. Let's look at other things. Fiscal conservatives favor transparency. As we've said, private school, just because a student has a voucher, they do not have to admit that student. If your student has dyslexia, learning disabilities, in Indiana, they don't have to take the student. They can give you tests, they can give you entrance exams, but they don't have to take you. If you do join that private school, there may be a requirement that you have to go to that church and now follow the teachings of that church. Special needs students, their enrollment can be denied. We really don't know how the dollars are being spent. And lawmakers were continuously sold on the idea that we have all these kids that need a choice to escape failing schools. Well, in 2022, there were 44,000 students on vouchers in Indiana. Now, the state requires the student to document how they are entering the program. This data comes from the Indiana DOE annual report of vouchers, and we had 420 students, 421, that documented, and the schools documented, were leaving failing schools out of 44,000. So the whole we're going to rescue kids from failing schools mantra has not really panned out. It's been a program to pay for people already at private schools. This kind of documents the enrollment. This again is from that DOE report. Rural and small towns, about 7,000 students. We're not really being served in the same numbers of these programs. Ethnicity kind of breaks out, kind of follows Indiana's ethnicity overall, but majority of the students being served are white, but so are they in public schools. And so when I look at all these things through the lens of a fiscal conservative, they're not really present. So if you live and carry fiscal conservative perspectives, I'd have to question long term how that fits with the voucher program. There's been some other unintended consequences from my opinion. There's been a lack of higher ed investment in Indiana. We're spending all this money on choices. Since 2015, we have seen a huge decline in the number of students attending colleges. Indiana is towards the bottom of the nation in our investment per capita in higher ed. Our goal is to have 60,000, but we have less than 53% of our high school students choosing to go to higher ed. So that is scary if you are interested in workforce. Now, since there's less Indiana kids going to higher ed, our higher ed institutions have been very good at collecting students from out of state. We're 14th in the nation in getting students to come to Indiana for college. However, once those students graduate, we're 40th in the nation in retaining those graduates. They're leaving our state. And this comes from our own Indiana college. I mean, this is a big focus for our higher ed commission under Governor Hochul. So we're acknowledging it. We got to work on it. Our per capita student funding is still last in the Midwest. This is actual expenditures. We're tied with Kentucky in 2022 data on actual spending. This is not dollars put in the budget, but actual spending. And the L represents local dollars, S equals state, F equals federal, and total 12.8. We're tied with Kentucky, but we're behind all of our neighboring states. And this is Chris Lagoni's perspective. I think, in my opinion, our state's a little bit addicted to the gambling revenue. Each one of those green shades represents a casino in the state of Indiana. We like to have them near Chicago. That's really nice. The two near Indianapolis, those were horse tracks previously, but the state expanded gambling and turned them into horse track casinos. And then the ones in the bottom green, that's near Cincinnati's metropolitan area, in the bottom right. And then the one in the bottom left, that's by Louisville. And then the one in the bottom, far bottom left, that's near Evansville. But we then rolled out sports gambling, and lawmakers were told, here's our projected revenue on sports gambling. Then COVID hit, and that kind of blew that up. And then there's a new bill this year to expand to online gaming and casinos. Who knows where that will go? But this is just my opinion. I see a real correlation to the expansion of vouchers and paying for them and our addiction to tax revenue from gaming sources. Okay, Rod?
Thank you, Chris. We have time for a few questions, and we have two wonderful people, Carolyn Hawley over there and Paula Keller over here with microphones. So if you want to ask Dr. Lagoni a question, just raise your hand, and we'll answer as many questions as we can over the next 10, 15 minutes.
I have one right here.
Okay.
I think you got it for most of the graphs, but you lay out in this, with the voucher passing, who are the winners and who are the losers in Indiana?
I think the tuition support dollars kind of shows you all the schools in that graph in the bottom right, all the schools went down in per student funding. So I'm not going to, rural, urban, whatever. I think the biggest winner has been the Archdiocese. They're the greatest consumer of vouchers, and they've been the best customer. And I don't have anything against it. They've just been the biggest revenue gain from vouchers.
Here we go.
Could you characterize the lobbying effort that was undertaken from both in-state and out-of-state sources to get these laws passed in Indiana?
I would say that once the door was open, there was a floodgates of full-time people running our hallways 24/7, 365 a year. Come to this Florida thing. You need to come to my institute. Do this. Constantly, once the floodgates were opened and Indiana became a voucher state.
Thank you for your presentation. And I'm just wondering, what's your threshold for passing levies and bonds in your state?
For a local levy, it can be a simple majority.
I have a question down here in this aisle anywhere. Here we go.
Thank you. I'd like to know the size of the rural schools, communities that you're talking about. When you say rural school, I'd like to compare that to Idaho. The other thing I didn't pick up is what is your dollar per student?
Obviously, it goes up. It's approaching 6,800, 70, upper 7,000s. Who knows what will be in the next budget? 2021 was a very good budget. The governor came out and said there's about $600 million shortfall. So we go all the way back to 2009, 300 million plus makeup, and then 357. So the state did in 2021 added 600 million in tuition support to make up for that. So I'd have to get back to you, but I know it's north of 7,000. I can get you that data. Give me a second.
Good question. Have you done any looks at church attendance and whether this has had any influence on church attendance in the state?
I have not. I just know that we've gained about 14,000 private school attendees. I don't know if those are church schools or non-denominational, just private schools. I don't know anybody collects data on church attendance in Indiana, but I haven't, no.
Is there any evidence of improved educational outcomes?
Well, the Notre Dame study from 18 had not found any. In fact, they found that there had been drops in math.
So, no. Yeah. With the chart in the top right, the change in total tuition support per pupil, where is the current data? That's 5 years old. Do you have like recent data for that?
I don't. SEEP doesn't have that. That was just showing you what it was like as the voucher expansion started in 2011. So I thought it aligned well to kind of document the path Indiana went on. Does that make sense?
On the chart about the kind of the go-on rate was certainly concerning. Is there you have a comparison of that to national trends?
The rate for what? Yeah, I think I can the India. It's on the Indiana Higher Ed Commission's website. I can pull that up and send it to you.
How that compares to national rates?
I can't imagine it's very good. I know overall people are questioning the value of higher ed, and that's something that our Commission on Higher Ed is examining. I can find that for you and get it to you.
Hi, is there any data that demonstrates how this has impacted students with disabilities or those students who are receiving special education services and the impact on them?
Well, if you use test scores, overall, since the pandemic, nobody's test scores and special ed test scores have been very good. There's not any real clear data on how many special ed service students are being serviced in the private school, because if they attend the private school, the local public school still has to provide services. So they're still required. So if I have a Catholic school or a Christian school or a non-denominational school, the special ed co-op still has to provide services for those students. So it's just a matter of whether general education is being served by the school or the private school.
Can you give us an indication, what was sort of the expected number of additional private school students or voucher users that was going to happen when the policy was first being implemented? If I understood what you said right, 14,000 is kind of the number that has.
Yeah, they set a threshold the first year to kind of roll it out slowly. And there was a expectation when it first started that students would attend public schools for 2 semesters, maybe kindergarten or something, and then you would, if you were dissatisfied or felt like you were going to an F school, then you would have the ability to have another choice. But that quickly in the next session and sessions after that was slowly eroded away to where there became this whole litany of tests. Well, maybe if you have a sibling that's already at a school, you can go. And, all that makes sense from the parent perspective. I've already got one student going to this Catholic school. I'd like a voucher for this student, to where over time it just became about setting different income levels and ever increasing the income level of students who could access a voucher. As I said, we increased it to 300% poverty. We don't know what will be the ask in this year's legislature, but it's ever expanding to, it's just going to be the push for a universal voucher.
Hi. Given all of this data, and you have over a decade worth of these trends, is your state committed to staying on this path, or is there some kind of indication of changing paths in the legislature?
I've not seen any indication in the legislature that there's a political will to change direction. I think if we're honest, there's people in private caucus meetings who, not everyone's totally, this is the way we want to go, but the dam is open, the dike's flowing. It'll be very difficult to go back and, I call it in some ways, if you're looking at a universal voucher, or a universal credit card, it's almost an entitlement program. Once you pass something out, it's very difficult to roll that back. So there's no plans that I'm aware of to do anything but continue the conversation for expansion.
Has there been any studies on how, if this same amount of money had been spent on the existing schools and improvements of those, how that might have been more advantageous than going to a voucher program?
When you ask legislators about that, they say, well, we may not have spent that money on public schools. So it's kind of there was a Dr. Phil Downs from Trine University did a lot of research documenting the dollars and had it gone back to the individual schools. And he did a lot of research in this area and how that would have benefited those schools. And then when you presented it to lawmakers, there's no guarantee that we would have advocated those dollars for the rest of the schools.
I think that's it.
When the $5,900 in state funding per student, by the time you throw in federal, we get close to almost 7,000. So to answer that question, around $5,900 in 2023 per student.
Well, thank you, Chris, for coming clear across the country, and thank you. A lot of good questions. Our purpose today was really to start opening this up as a conversation. It's an important conversation, and I know that over the next few months, there's going to be a lot of discussion about this. So this is a way we wanted to get the conversation started. So thank you for being with us today. Appreciate it. $307 million, my research showed $307 million would have gone to the public schools if there hadn't been a vouchers program. Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely. I'm Rod Grammer. Yeah, we met when we did an apprenticeship